What you're saying is, even if you're lacking necessarily in some of the background, but there's many dimensions of a business, and sometimes coming from the outside can be advantageous. So you're bringing a different skill set, and you can learn within the domain what you need to, as long as you're motivated enough and you're pulled toward it.
Yeah, you have to be willing to do the 100 phone calls, right? Like, you have to want, okay, maybe your outside perspective is great, maybe it's not, but like, you need to understand why the industry works that way. Whether it's you agree with it or not is irrelevant. First, you have to understand it, which usually means having a lot of conversations, a lot of reading. You know, I remember starting Flatiron, I had, you know, like notebooks. This is like before you took notes on a computer, because I'm old. Like, you had notebooks of stuff that, you know, just layers and layers of notes. And in biotech, I mean, if you look at my calendar in 2020, 2021, and you just went like day by day, it would be like 40 phone calls a week, something like that, 30 phone calls a week, just like asking questions. How does it work this way? Why does it work that way? You know, I think you have to be willing to do that. Yeah.
So is that the main approach that you took, or do you have any other tips for if someone wants to really get smart on an industry, like how you do that or how you would suggest?
People, always people, like experts in particular. I think we underestimate how much knowledge is not written down. Like, it's just not in a blog post, sorry. It's not in a, you know, McKinsey industry report. I mean, that stuff is good, and it gives you kind of a lay of the land of like the terminology and who the players are. It gives you the surface layer. But the really important nuanced stuff is just in people's heads. And you have to find the people, and then you have to figure out how to get it out of them and ask the question in the right way. So my process has always been talking to people, doing expert calls, getting intros to the next set of experts, digging, to the point where, like, you know, you've done it well, where you talk to one expert and then they recommend 2 others, you're like, I've already talked to them. And like, when you get to that point where you're starting to see patterns in the people that are being recommended, and you've like talked to 80% of them, all right, now you're in the belly of the beast. You know, now you know all the right people. And so then it's just a matter of like, are you good enough at getting the information out and synthesizing it? And some people aren't, but yeah, it's been expert calls. Like, one of my co-founders at Curie, there's 4 of us, basically was like, I just loved his take on this. He said, if I took a scientific problem that I know nothing about, literally nothing, I don't even know what the words mean, right? And if you gave me like 20 hours and 20 phone calls, I will be a better expert at that thing than you reading a paper any day. And he's right. And he's right, because like, there's only so much in the reading. There's only so much in the paper. If you know the right people to call, the right people to talk to, you know, you'll figure it out better than the next person, because most of that information is here. And so that's what I've gotten really good at. I don't think I knew it back in the day that this was like the right approach. I guess kind of like discovered it. But that's how we did Flatiron. 18 months took, give or take, to like really find the idea. It took about 18 months. And then Curie was like 12 to 18 or so. And I had a head start, because like, by the first time is the hardest, right? Because nobody wants to meet you. They're like, who the fuck are you? So like, you know, you don't get the meeting, and your hit rate is low, and it's, you know, the bar for people sharing information with you when you're a first-time founder is really high, because you're viewed skeptically. And then now I send someone an email, they answer the email, right? Like, I have an advantage, and so this one, you know, we could shortcut it. That's why second-time founders and third-time founders, I think, have better chances of success. It's just because like your hit rate with people is higher. But yeah, that's been the process, just out in the field, really. Field now really means Zoom, to be clear, but effective field.
Nice. That's great. Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about data. I know that was a big part of Flatiron, obviously. And maybe you could share initially, I know Flatiron was more using processes and workflows to clean and organize the data. Could you talk a little bit about how data was used, and if or what kind of role AI was at Flatiron?
No AI. No, we had a little bit. We had a small team, about 10 people or so, of like 500, to give you a sense of scale. Yeah, I mean, everything in my life lesson in healthcare is everything in context. Like, there are no rules in healthcare. The rule is understand the problem that you're working on, and each one is a little different. The incentives are different. The diseases are different. And so, people would come to me and say, oh, I'm doing Flatiron for like XYZ disease. I'm like, that has absolutely nothing to do with what we did over here because the disease characteristics are different. And you can tell those people just don't understand the details. For us, the idea, at least the thesis for Flatiron, was that when you see your oncologist, this is post-diagnosis, right? So you've been diagnosed with the disease, that there's a lot of information about you, your disease, and the treatments that you are receiving, the diagnostics that are, think imaging, scans, things like that, as well as like your response or lack thereof to the treatment that sit in the electronic health record. It's specifically in the record because oncology is a very in-person treatment, or like it's not pills in your home, right? Most of the treatments are infusions. You're actually in the office. The physician, your oncologist kind of becomes your PCP. And so we felt like there was this really rich data set inside the EHR, particularly in oncology, which is not true in other disease areas, right? Like in diabetes, as an example, it's not like your chart has all the stuff. Like in diabetes, what matters is outside the office. It's actually what's happening to you throughout the day. And so the data set that matters there is very different. But in oncology, it was in the chart. And then there were some really interesting nuances about how the treatments, the drugs in oncology, the trial is run on like a certain population of a certain type, of a certain size. And then when that drug makes its way out into the real world, the population looks different. And it looks different for a variety of reasons. People are older, they're sicker, they're more minorities because minorities don't really participate in clinical trials, which is a whole other topic. And so the pharmaceutical companies would be interested in understanding what was happening in the real world because the trial data was only one piece of the picture. And so we built an entire money-losing business to aggregate data from cancer centers through the electronic health, basically getting access to the EHR. We built this like data curation infrastructure, which is just a fancy way of saying like nurses looking at charts and like abstracting data from charts. And then we built a pharma business, which is where the money was made on the other side. So we actually had to build almost like 3 companies in one. And we used, healthcare data is really messy. A lot of natural language, a lot of like imprecise language, actually. Suspicion of, right? What does that mean? Right, so you have to, there's just, we felt that there was a quality bar for medical data that was higher than what ML specifically and like the language models could do. And so we had a human curation team. And then we used machine learning in smart ways, primarily to do like search space reduction. So as just like, not to sound too high level, but if you're looking for patients with a certain disease characteristic, right? And you have 1 million charts to look through, well, how do you find the 20,000 that you probably should look through? And so we would use machine learning in really clever ways to reduce the workload. But it was not a core tool in the actual end product, right? The end. That was just unique to our business. I don't think that depends. I just go back to the same thing, which is like, what is the problem you're working on? And does it make sense for this domain or not? And sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes it's like a light tool, sometimes a heavy tool. Fit the problem, fit the solution to the problem, not the other way around. I mean, I can't tell you now how many of the same call I get. I had one today, which is like a bunch of X, and I apologize if any of you are this person, like X Google Brain, X like Facebook AI research, X whatever, basically like AI research people being like, hey, these language models are really cool. I think I can apply them in healthcare. I'm like, cool. You are just a giant hammer searching for a nail. Like you don't understand anything about the industry, about the problem set. You're just like, I got this, I'm like, where can I put this? And I think 95%, 98% of those people are just gonna fail miserably when they get into healthcare because like the tool is one sliver of the problem. Like you have to deeply understand what's going on in the domain. It just goes back to that same fact. Like, do you really understand this? Do you really are you an expert? Are you an expert in your area? Can you talk about the details of the product all the way up to the strategy? the players, the competition, the nuances of the products. The best founders I know are a fucking encyclopedia about their industry, right? They just know everything, and that doesn't happen overnight. You know, it takes 2 years, 3 years. So.
That's interesting. So just digging in on that, if Flatiron Health was founded like more than a decade ago now, if you were to do it again today, given the advances in language processing, would you still take the same approach, or do you think that fundamentally doesn't really work in what you're doing?
We would try it and see how accurate it was. I don't know. We'd have to really understand what the language models can and can't do, and the only way to do that would be to just try it. So yeah, we probably would have like a slightly bigger focus, because theoretically the quality would be higher than it was when we were starting, and then we would see what was actually possible, in the weeds.
Cool. Whether related or totally separate from AI, are there any other innovations that have happened in the last few years or I guess put another way, like what are you really excited about with Curie that, what's driving the space forward now?
I get to do the Curie pitch now?
Yes,
okay,
please.
All right, cool. I was trying not to be the salesman. Okay, so here's the background and the thesis for Curie, and I will answer this question of like what's exciting. If you look at, since we have a software crowd, if you look at software, what has happened over the last 20 some odd years, starting right around 2003, 2004 with cloud computing, was that the cost to start a software company came down, right? The amount of money you have to spend right in the beginning, like day zero, went from 7, 10, 12 million, and that's in like $2,000, right? So that's the equivalent of what, 25, 30 million today, to like 2 million. Because you could rent the infrastructure. You didn't have to build the data center, you didn't have to buy all the equipment, like the servers and the disk space and all this, and then the tools got better, and then they got better, and they got better, and all of a sudden, this idea of like starting a software company in your garage became a reality for like almost any idea. I mean, most of these companies were started effectively in a garage, right? Like, 2 people in a room. And so the cost to start software companies comes down. The cost to try, kind of think about it, like how much money do I need to figure out if this thing could work, comes down. And then what do we see happen? We see seed funds pop up, because all of a sudden you're like, well, shit, I can write a $2 million check instead of a $10 million check. And so for my $10 million, now I get 5 shots on goal instead of 1. So I'm going to do more of it. And then founder ownership goes up, right? Because now you can raise less money in the beginning, so you give up less of your own company, and all of a sudden it's financially really interesting to be a founder. You guys remember all the like acqui-hires that were happening back in like the mid 2000s? I mean, I knew people had started a company like 9 months later at $10 million, because they were just, the economics were really good. And so you had all of these factors coming together at the same time, and software just explodes. Like it explodes over 25 years. Because the risk reward of like, how hard is this going to be and how much am I going to own, kind of like does this, right? And it's this beautiful perpetual cycle. And I think it was enabled first and foremost just by cloud. It's just cost structure came down. And then, there's a lot of other things. Biotech is really interesting because if you look historically, the assumption, and when I say biotech, I'm using this term very loosely, I'm talking about therapeutics. So like companies that make drugs or eventually make a drug. The cost to start a therapeutic company has been materially high, right? We're talking like 20, 30, 40 million dollars. This idea of like, you can't, it's the first slide in our deck. You can't start a therapeutics company in your garage. And then we have this little thing that says yet at the end of it, right? Like it's not possible yet. The history of biotech is really expensive day zero costs, right? Because basically you have to build a lab. Like it's an expensive proposition. You got to build this physical space. You have to hire all these people. You got to put the equipment in there. By the way, you can't just like lab, right? Like it takes a year. You do it in these like really expensive places in Boston and San Francisco, which makes no sense. And so lots of money at the earliest phase. Founders get diluted to hell, so they don't really own their own company. And few ideas get funded because the amount of money you have to put in is really high, really risky. And so the risk appetite from investors comes down. It's just math, right? It's not good or bad, it just kind of is. What is changing in biotech is that the cost to do early preclinical, pre-human work has been coming down. And it's been coming down for a variety of reasons. It's not one thing. Everything from like cost of sequencing is much cheaper. Cost to like synthesize chemicals has gotten cheaper. The other thing that's happened is the vendors that will do this for you have gotten better, right? So you have vendors out there, most of them are ex-US, they're not in the US, but think like, you may have heard some of these names like Wuxi or Pharmaron or Chem Partners or Evotech, which is in Europe. It's groups in India, but it's heavily like Asia and Europe, where you can basically like outsource the initial set of experiment work because they have the infrastructure at scale. And they're better at it, right? Because they have teams of people, they've hired them already, they've done this 20 times, they have specialized expertise. This didn't really exist like 8 or 9 years ago at any sort of quality. And so what's happened recently is that they just got better. Like it's, it wasn't overnight, it was just like this little stepwise, we do this, then we do this. And all of a sudden you're like, shit, this group actually is better at doing, this work than I could. And so when I was getting into this, I didn't understand, like I learned about this idea that costs were coming down. People were pretty consistent, like, yeah, they're coming down. They're not coming down for everything, but they're coming down for kind of common modalities. Think small molecules like pills in a bottle, biologics like engineered proteins, and a few other areas. I was like, where the hell are all the seed companies? Because you would assume if the costs come down, you would see more seed stage startups, you'd see more founders, and I didn't really see it. There's like, just to give you some stats, something like 200 to 300 new therapeutic companies, biotech actually broadly, that are like funded every year. In software, there's like 14,000. So you're like order of magnitude different, right? And so like what's going on? And our thesis came down to that it's not just the money, it's the money and the access. It's the access to the right people, to those vendors, to experts, to all the things you need as a founder to get started, which is really like a lot of this stuff, that is really hard to do when your email address is like Weinberg@gmail and not at harvard.edu or at Flagship or at Third Rock or wherever fancy place you are, right? Like the minute you're on your own, nobody pays attention to you. And unfortunately, this is the real pitch, by the way. This is how I raised this money on this story. So you're hearing this is the first group I've actually pitched it to externally. When you've gone out to start a biotech company, you end up with these like series of places you can make mistakes, right? You pick the wrong target, you select the wrong vendor, you design the wrong program, just like so many little places you can go wrong. You don't find the information you need because it wasn't in the paper, it was actually in like that dude's head over there, and like you just couldn't get on the phone with him. There's a lot of that. And unfortunately, mistakes in biotech are very expensive. It's not like software, where if you make a mistake in the code or in the product, you can just like go and fix it that night, right? In biotech, we're talking about like 6, 12 months and $1 million. And you gotta go all the way back to the beginning. And so I think of it as just this like giant catch-22, which is at the moment in time in which you are most likely to make the mistake because like no one's helping you, it's also the point in time where the mistakes hurt you the most. Right? That's the synthesis of the whole thing. Like, oh shit, mistakes are really expensive and it's hard to not make them. And so Curie is a new type of entity we designed, which is basically, we took a venture fund. We have a $270 million seed stage venture fund. And we basically like stapled it. We started 2 companies. We stapled it to a services entity that is like deep drug discovery expertise. These are like the best people in the world and access to the experts around them who don't just pick the company, but like materially help you as a founder in a model where you still own the majority of your own thing, right? You take advantage of the cost structure stuff because now you can raise less money and we can guide you through this process, but you get some of the best drug hunters and drug makers, is what we call them, in the world, co-piloting alongside you. And you can think of it as like YC on steroids, but it's focused in biotech. If you're familiar with the industry, I like to think of it as like Flagship for everyone, right? So like, how do you take the depth of expertise inside one of these incubators and bring it out in a model where the founder doesn't get fucked from an ownership perspective? And my theory behind this is that if you make being a biotech founder a better career decision, more people will do it. And if you have more people do it, you have more ideas, you have more shots on goal, you have more medicines, you have like, the industry will grow. It's like what happened to cloud in 2003. The reason it's been so challenging is that it's just, you have to raise a lot of money. And so we raised over $500 million privately to do this, which we'll announce in about 2 weeks. And so, yeah, think like best place to start a therapeutics company, even though it's not actually a place. It's probably the better way of saying is like the best group to start a therapeutics company with. My co-founders, 2 of my co-founders are basically if you know the industry, Third Rock Ventures, which is one of the best biotech incubators in the world. They're ex-Third Rock partners. They have been founders of like $30 billion of biotech companies. I'm just like the idiot that raises the money, basically, which is great. At least I know my role, and they do all the science. But it's meant that, hence that little like pithy tagline we have of like free the founders. That's what we mean. It's like, how do you get more, in particular scientists, it's really focused on physical scientists, not necessarily computer science, but we do both, to start their own companies. Like, take a risk. And now it's an easier decision for you to make. And I'm sure, I don't know if there's any biotech founders in the room here, but I would bet many of the things I probably mentioned, you're like, oh yeah, that was happening to me. Like, nobody paid attention. Oh, it was hard to like find the vendor. You know, I couldn't even get the vendor to return my call because my budget was too small. You know, stuff like that. And that's what we're solving. It's like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we'll announce it. We've done 4 companies so far, quietly. We funded last year, and we're going to hopefully do another 15 or so, maybe, this year. It's about 25 people, will be 60 at the peak, and it's almost all scientists. It's effectively all drug discovery PhDs, chemists, biologists, things like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So are most of the startups that you're funding focused on drug development?
Almost
basically?
everyone. I think of it as like, if the way you make money at the end of the day is you make a drug, we're the first phone call. If you sell software to other biotechs, thank God you exist, but that's not what we're funding, right? Our expertise is not in building your technology, it's in applying your technology to a drug program, right? Because, you know, you take a really interesting, I'll give you actually like a real example. This is one of our portfolio companies. It's actually two guys with CS backgrounds, so no drug discovery experience, who have a really unique mathematical model to find what they call like cryptic pockets in a protein. Basically, like places you could drug a protein that aren't easy to think through or aren't easy to find, for a variety of reasons. Because when you like crystallize the protein, it crystallizes into a particular conformation, to a particular shape. But that's not actually how it looks in real world because it's doing this. And so there's other spots. Cool. And the tech is really awesome, and it actually works with like it's driven by a lot of the advancements in recent ML stuff that I don't understand. But okay, cool, which proteins? Like of the billion things you could possibly do, where do you apply it? Why? In what order? How do you actually test that the pocket you found is real? Right? And there's like these series of questions that immediately come out. And that's what we do for them, right? We work on the target list, we work on the vendor list, we work on the assay development, and kind of guide them through end to end. And we do it with our team, and then we do it with a series of experts. In a funny way, it's a lot of what I learned about like getting experts at the table is part of what we actually do at Curie. It's like we get you the expert. Because we don't have all the expertise in-house, but we find you the person who's the expert in whatever it is you need. That's a real company. That's one of the ones we'll announce in a few weeks. So,
nice.
Yeah.
So it sounds like most of the challenges that you guys deal with is mostly technical as opposed to regulatory or cultural.
Yeah, we're preclinical, right? So like we're pre-IND, meaning like you're not yet putting this or close to putting it in a human. So there's a series of regulatory steps that happen kind of after us. But for the most part, there's no regulatory expertise needed because it's just not what we're working on. I'm sure there will be some exceptions, and we'll go find an expert where we need to. But yeah, it's really more about like, biological cell, like assays and mice and monkeys, and not yet at humans. And the hope is like eventually, for each of these companies, they get to a human, right? They get to the clinical development program, and then you see if it works, because everything else is just the best guess. So, yeah, there's no software, which is weird for me. There's no regulatory people. It's really all science. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. All tech, as you said, it's really technical. Yeah.
I'm curious, so touching on an earlier conversation we had, when you're creating medicines, I guess you're mostly treating a disease that's already, shown itself, occurred. How do you think about prevention of disease?
Yeah. Well, I'm for it. I don't know.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, like,
Seems like a good thing.
Of course.
No, I know. I'm just fucking.
Yeah.
It's hard, right? Because like, what do you measure? And I think that's the first question you have to ask is like, how do you know it's working? And we don't have like great or any really longevity biomarkers, right? We have things that maybe correlate with lifespan, but like honestly, it's more predictive. If I could ask you like 3 questions, I could get your like BMI, your family history, and like whether you smoke. I bet you I would be more accurate than almost any model with like just those 3 questions. And so I think the question for longevity has always been, what are you measuring that shows if it's working or not? Because if the thing you have to measure is death, then it's going to be a long time before you know whether anything works. And then you have all these confounders that come in, right? The longer the study runs, the less you know whether it was the thing you were doing that's driving it versus just like random chance. So I think it makes it very difficult for longevity type companies to exist because there's no clear path. We'll see. Like, we're looking at, I've seen a few really interesting companies that are trying to do earlier detection of like neurodegenerative diseases. So think Alzheimer's and dementia. And so theoretically, if you get a good, accurate diagnostic of dementia, early dementia, you could measure prevention earlier in the cycle. But the reality is like right now we're not particularly good at it because the MRI, the brain MRI is like, doesn't really show up until the disease is really bad. And so you could look at a reasonably a brain and not know, essentially. I mean, it's more complexity than that, but that's the basics. I think that's always the challenge. What are we measuring that shows, that something's truly going to work? And it's a lot of it's pseudoscience in mice, right? A lot of it's like, oh, we did this thing and mice live longer. And it's like, yeah, a lot of things work in mice. We had this stupid joke at Flatiron. It's like, the best time to get cancer is if you're a mouse. Because like, done, you're cured, easy. We can cure anything in a mouse. But then you stick it in a person, and it's a little more complicated of a biological system here. So, it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be a tough market. That's why you see a lot of these longevity companies pivot, if you will, to a more actionable disease. They work on diabetes, maybe they work in neuro.
Interesting. I'm curious also, I've seen kind of a general trend within the health space of health moving more into personal hands of individual people. Like, it can manifest as like fitness trackers, but also, I'm wondering if you're seeing health being pushed more to the edges, and if that might change how, the healthcare system works at all, in your opinion.
I have a strong opinion. I think this like self-measurement craze, like fitness tracker, sleep tracker, what else? I don't know. There's like a few of these trackers. I think it's all bullshit. Like, we're basically telling healthy people who already know exactly what you're supposed to do to just do the thing. I'm fine if it's like a behavioral nudge and that's really what's going on here. Like, okay, what should you not? What do these things tell you? Let me take a guess. Don't drink. because it fucks with your sleep, right? Don't smoke. Try not to eat really late. Try not to eat sugar. White breads, like they're not good for you because they become sugar. Run, exercise a little bit, eat yogurt. That really, get your colonoscopy when you're supposed to, get your mammogram when you're supposed to, and like if you smoked before, make sure you do like lung cancer screening. That's all we know. And I guarantee you the result of almost any of these like tracker things is basically one of those recommendations. Maybe it's like dressed up to be a little prettier than that, but that's basically what they're going to tell you. And most of the people who are using these already know the answer. They already know. Now, if it works for you, right? Like if it's the thing that gets you to like not eat the donut at 1 a.m., I'm all for it. Sounds great. Like to me, that's just a behavioral nudge, and it sounds good. But I don't think it's really health. Like I don't think that's health care. I think healthcare is really about people who are sick or very likely to be sick, think pre-diabetic and then beyond. And how do you either prevent serious disease or manage early disease or then manage serious disease? And it's not people in their 20s or in their 30s or really in their 40s. It tends to be, the older segment. And then look, every once in a while, someone will come up with a tool or a diagnostic or something that actually works, and is material. There's obviously been like a lot of improvements in diabetes in particular, just like the actual physical hardware to measure glucose has gotten significantly better for people. Like it used to be a really shit experience, and now it's a lot better. That kind of stuff to me is really interesting because it makes like somebody with real healthcare challenges, that makes their life a lot better. The like over-the-top direct-to-consumer stuff, I don't buy it. Not that I think it's going to be a zero from a financial perspective. I just don't think it matters. I don't think it's important. But as with all of these things, like there'll be 1,000 things that are tried, and most suck and don't work, and then like 1 or 2 of them will actually be important over the line. It's hard to know which ones. We were talking before, like you can make the argument maybe in testosterone replacement therapy for men in like their 40s and 50s. The data looks interesting. Again, like what are you measuring, right? Like how do you know? So they measured things like virality and like it's like all these like pseudo measurements of health. But hey, people feel better. One of the biggest lessons I had from working in oncology for 10 years was like, oh yeah, that's healthcare. That's actually what we're talking about. Like we're talking about the cancer patient who has CHF, right? And is in the hospital like once a month. That's really what the healthcare, that's where all the money goes, that's where all the costs go, that's where all the inefficiencies are, that's where all the drugs are for. So when I think of healthcare, I think Medicare. Actually, like the first thing that comes to mind is like the Medicare population, 65 and older. There's other subsegments, obviously, but yeah, I don't think it's like the Silicon Valley version of health. Go to the gym.
Got it. So it's pretty clear what you're not looking for, but as someone who's invested in hundreds of startups, can you share anything that's kind of your unique angle of what you look for in a startup to invest in?
In healthcare?
Or in general?
In general, I look for founders. So we do like seed investing. So it's there's only so much you can evaluate about the actual business. Like there's not a lot of spreadsheets. So I look for founders who I call it stretching up and down, but it's basically this idea that the same person, can talk through the strategy, the customer, the business, the market, the money, the TAM, the margin structure, whatever, and then they can also talk to you like in excruciating detail about the product. It's the same person. Because it's that little loop of like, I talked to this customer and I learned this thing, and that's going to influence the product, and you got to like run that loop a few times. And if it's 3 people, the quality of that feedback deteriorates as you pass the information along. And so we look for founders that can stretch up and down. And then this is just about people. And then we look for founders who are likely to attract talent. And that doesn't mean they have to be like gregarious or, the like Adam Newman show type people. Like that works to be clearly. It's just some founders have a thing where you talk to them and you're like, yeah, I would work with you. You know, you've like reasonable, you're humble, but opinionated, and you seem to know your shit, and you ask good questions, but you don't just like give up when someone pushes back. We look for that because the hardest part is to build the team. And if you can't attract good people, like you don't really have a great shot at building something big. You can build something small. And then on the idea, we look for somebody that has really just understands the details, right? Like they can, it's the same stuff, it's just how they express it, right? They can talk about the technology, they can talk about the market, they can tell you why they made certain decisions. That's for like most startups. The challenge with healthcare is you could do all of that and just have the wrong idea and it still doesn't work. Because healthcare doesn't allow you to make mistakes in the strategy. It beats you up immediately because there's no pivoting in healthcare, right? You kind of like pick your, you're there, and it's really hard to switch the industry, the disease, the customer segment. And so for those, we're a little pickier. I want to make sure this person actually understands what they're getting themselves into. Who are you selling to? Why would they buy it? How are they going to pay for it? What does reimbursement look like? Those we really think about the business model. If it's just like a SaaS thing for developers or whatever, some like I shouldn't say simple, but some simple business model, we're not going to scrutinize it as much. Like, I know how software works, right? You build it once, you sell it 1,000 times, the margins are really good, done. It's a great business. It's the ones where you're like, how do you make money exactly? Those we try and tease out. And we've done a good job in healthcare in particular because I know it well. Software, I think, is a little harder. Sometimes, you know, if you ask me like what the latest and greatest in the language models look like today, like I don't really know. Like I know they're interesting and important and better, but could I tell you like the frameworks people are using to do it? No, I've lost that. I've lost that skill. Mm. Yeah.
Nice. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you a question about crypto.
Okay. Great.
I know you're a bit of a famous crypto skeptic, and I'm definitely not going to attempt to debate you.
You're not going to pitch me an idea?
Some other people who have tried to do that.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you about something kind of adjacent to crypto and healthcare, which is decentralized science. I don't know if you have any opinions or if you're familiar at all with the space.
I don't know what it means. I mean, please feel free to define it, but I don't know what it means.
I'll try to, but I'm not an expert, but just to give some grounds for the conversation. I mean, some people are trying to use, whether blockchain or not, but to solve some of the problems of science. It's kind of like the open science movement, but so whether it's through creating different incentive structures for funding science to try to bring things out of academia, transition them into commercialization. It's also related to how data is shared, try to break out of the silos, help with reproducibility, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I get. I'm cool with crowdfunding. I mean, that's basically what it sounds like to me. It's like, hey, we're just gonna like crowdfund something. I too have used Kickstarter, and that sounds great. Like, if a bunch of people want to pool their money and fund a science project and vote on like which one to fund, sounds good. You don't need the blockchain for that. You can just do it. And then the data sharing side of things, I think what almost every entrepreneur quickly learns is that it's not a technology problem. Like, people don't share data, not because they can't figure out how to. Like, GitHub exists, right? Like, we have unlimited ways to share data. The issue is incentives and what you share and why. I mean, if you think of academia, right? Like, academia rewards scientific publishing in most cases. And so you create this like awesome new fancy data set, and now we're showing up and saying, hey, I know your like career, you're probably in debt, is relying on publishing on this unique data set, but could you just like share it with the rest of the world so they can publish? And it's like, well, most people aren't gonna do that, right? Reality sets in of people they need money. and they have a job, they have kids, and they need to like survive. So I view this. I think the goals are great. I think the implementations, it's just like a fancy brand on something we've tried before, which is crowdfunding science. I wish there were. The reality of science is really expensive. It's really expensive, and like a few $1 million from a few people here and there is going to do nothing. It's just not used. It's not big enough. I mean, what's the NIH budget? Like a few $100 billion. I don't know. It's big, and everyone already complains about how small it is, right? So, pharma R&D budgets are a few $100 billion. Yeah, I think it's just it's hammer searching for a nail. Same, we have this tool. Where can we apply it? But hey, again, I truly, if people want to pool their money to fund an interesting lab, it sounds great.
Cool. Thanks for that.
I was trying to be nice.
No.
Not like this is the dumbest fucking idea I've ever heard, but yeah.
So I wanted to open it up for questions now. I think there's a lot of people in the audience who know a lot more than me about technology and bio. So we'll just start here.
So actually building off of what you said, I'm so curious to hear how the Curie model works with patents and kind of collaboration within the scientific community, because you use cloud computing as an example, but one of the reasons I think software development works is also because they're building on top of like open source technology. There's a culture there. How does that work in biotech?
So the patent that matters usually in bio, in therapeutics, is the drug patent, right? It's the patent on the end product, on the molecule that you put in a human, because that's what protects your ability to sell it at really high prices. And that's the incentive to develop it. And so we do not, in our model, we're not licensing existing drugs. We don't have to think about like, is this drug patent an issue, because we're not at the drug, right? We're working towards the drug. And so then the question is, all right, is there something, because eventually once you get to the drug, you patent it, right? Because it's new and novel and it's yours. Then the next question is like, okay, is there something in the process that is like particularly unique and protectable that you don't own? So we do more like defensive patent checking, like make sure you're not doing something that somebody else is going to sue you for. We have a law firm that does that check. And then we don't really care so much about whether your process is patented, because that's not where the value sits. The value sits in the drug. The other thing is when you file a patent, you have to like reveal quite a bit about what you do. And so I actually think there's some good arguments that you're better off thinking about it as a trade secret that you just kind of guard, rather than a patent that you file. It's very hard to like win on process patents. And so I think it's just common misconception in biotech of like what the patent does and doesn't do. And the patent really, again, you have to think of it as like at the end of the conveyor belt. That's the patent, the thing at the end, not the up front. I agree with you, by the way, like there's a lot of benefits of open source and software. That's why it's cheaper. Like bio's still expensive. Like we're going to write kind of $5 to $7 million checks instead of $1 to $2 million checks. So like there's your delta right there. It's still pretty big. But the vendors use, they buy the hardware from company A, and then they buy the reagents from company B, and they buy the, pipettes from company C, and you kind of like stick it all together. And so just because it's not open source doesn't mean it's not available. It just means you have to pay for it. And so it's just a little bit more expensive. Yeah, it'd be great if like every piece of the stack was free, but you also have to pay for AWS, and you have to pay for the database. You have to pay for like all the layers on top. So software's still better in the sense that it's easier, but we're chipping at it.
Cool. Thanks. And if you could try to summarize for the online
audience.
right,
because the mic.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's good.
Yeah, sure. So going back to the founding story of Flatiron, as an outsider in oncology, obviously beyond any personal experiences, to your point of speaking with experts, you sometimes get in the room with these amazing people in oncology, and you feel like an imposter sometimes. That right at the beginning, the first 2 years, then you get more comfortable. How did you get over that? And did you see reactions changing as you went along very much? Because, obviously it's different when you're 24 and you're pitching, the director, whatever at Sloan Kettering, and then working your way back from that.
Yeah, how do you create credibility in the room when you have none, kind of thing,
Yeah.
or you feel like you have none. Well, I feel like at the end I'm going to give away all the tips and tricks, and then there goes my edge. The people like to learn stuff in a conversation. They don't like to be just on the like receiving end of questions. They want to learn something. And actually, if they learn something from you, they're much more likely to share something they know as well, because they feel like they're talking to, in a very like true capitalistic framing, like someone useful to them, right? Like I can get something out of this person. Sometimes just knowledge, right? So I always tried to make sure I had something to teach, something that would engage this person and make me feel credible in some way. Now, for me, it was about software. I would always talk about, software development, and that I worked at Google for 2 years. You hear people are like, "Oh, Google, that's really cool," and I have like 1 or 2 Google stories, and then you'd get some credibility, and then you could start to ask. So I think of it as like, what can I share that gets you to believe that I'm not an idiot, basically? And we worked on that. We practiced it. What are those things? The other thing was like, I think you can use not being the expert to your advantage, because there isn't like the I'm trying to one up you, who's smarter type of thing. So we would definitely, and I still do this in biotech, I always try and couch my questions with like, look, I'm just the software guy, right? So like last time I took chemistry was in 11th grade. So let me just anchor you there, right? Half these words I don't understand. And then you can go and ask the question, and you find that the person on the other side is less defensive. They're more willing to teach. They're more willing to get. Now you have to have some credibility, right? You have to know something, and so you just have to find the balance between the two. I mean, this is the human element of being a founder, is about convincing people who have no business talking to you to talk to you, whether they're employees or experts or advisors or investors. So we just looked for tactics like that. I still think the like, I have something to teach you is by far and away the most effective tool I've ever had. And I would just repeat that one over and over. I have like a little war chest of stories I can tell that are tight, 2-3 minutes, because you don't have like that long to get someone's attention. Yeah. And then the imposter syndrome thing, I mean, yeah, I still have that, but I just have to put it away. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. We'll try to go back and forth. Okay, sure.
This is a very, very crude comparison, but the Flagship for everyone kind of sounds like Harvard versus Coursera. And I was wondering, like, what makes Flagship successful is a lot of precision and investing like $25 to $50 million in every shot on goal. And so how do you scale that success? Is it unloved disease areas? Is it new pools of talent? Is it through an investment profile or different investment profile? How do you do that?
Yeah, like what's the Flagship versus the Flagship for everyone thing? So first of all, Flagship doesn't put $25 to $50 million into every idea,
Sure.
right? They put them eventually into the idea. And my belief is like, well, that's the equivalent of going and raising a Series A. Right? Like, we're not telling you the $5 or $7 million that we're going to give you is going to get you into the clinic. It's just going to get you to the A. And then at the A, you go and raise that 25, 50, 75 million. Now, the difference is that you get to raise it from the market at a price that the market sets, meaning you get to retain ownership of your own thing. Whereas if you're an employee of a Flagship, you are raising money from your boss at any price they want, and you own 1%, maybe 0.5%, right? So there's just like a total economic shift between whose company is this, right? Is it my company or is it their company? With that said, there are certain ideas that are just so risky and so unique that like the market wouldn't fund them anyway. And if Flagship wants to fund all of those, that sounds great, right? Like this is I think of it as an and, right? There are some ideas that work in this model. There's some ideas that work in that model. So it's more about who's in control of the business. And then if you think of it as, I view it as we would apply to everybody, whereas Flagship kind of only applies to its employees. Where do the ideas come from? That creative spark, right? That like, I wonder if that would work, right? In an incubating model, that spark has to come from one of however many employees they have, 260, it depends on the firm, right? in a market model, that can come from one of like a few billion people. And not really a few billion, probably like a few 100,000 people who have the skill. So I'm going to take that market of ideas over the tight venture firm market. But not every idea can be done in this way, right? Like some ideas, yeah, you need $50 million to like buy the hardware because you're searching for new biology and like just doesn't exist. Yeah, like yes, you need that model. So I think of it as an and. The best heuristic I can give you is imagine for a second you are like a reasonably mid-career, like you're on the trajectory, I don't know, you're probably in like your 30s or late 30s or something in biotech. You work at a venture firm, at a Flagship or a Third Rock or whatever. So you're an employee, right? And you've got an idea and you think it's good. Do you want to start it at the venture firm you work for? Or do you want to start it and own it, right? And today, your option is primarily to basically just go like start it at the venture firm, and then you are essentially like a co-founder in title, maybe you get a job, maybe you own 1% of this thing, and the company gets formed and started and you sound all cool and it looks really good on your resume, but financially it kind of sucks. So what's your other choice? And our thesis is that other choice sucks too. Right? There's just not a lot of great places that you can go to do this idea on your own because you're like, well, shit, Flagship has like a lot of really good resources, a lot of incredibly smart people. They do, right? It's an unbelievable place of very, very bright people in multi-disease areas. And you have like all these resources. It's like easy. I don't talk to this person, this person. So our job as a firm is to recreate that feeling, but just outside of the firm. So the reason I don't like the Coursera example, I can give you this, is I view it as Coursera with the Harvard professors. It's like we poached all the Harvard professors and we said, now we're going to bring it out to the masses, but you're going to get the exact same quality people in a different world, whereas Coursera is kind of like lower tier, theoretically. I don't know, I don't use Coursera, but that's the idea. Yeah, it's a really good question though, because the nuance here is hard.
One from our friends in San Francisco. Before you landed on the idea specifically for Flatiron Health or Curie, how did your ideas evolve, like that led you to it?
Yeah, how did they change over time? Yeah. A lot. You know, they change as I pitch them, right? I would, in that same way of like seek expert feedback to find the idea, you know, the same process of validation, right? Like go pitch it and see what the reactions are, see what the questions are. Go back to the expert. You know, I mean, the Curie model didn't exactly look like this in the beginning. We weren't 100% sure of the structure. We kind of discovered it as we went along by just having conversations. It's just like the natural evolution. This, by the way, that question is exactly why in founders, we look for people who can do that with just one person, who can go and have the idea, go have the conversation with the investor or customer or whatever, hear something that's like, ah, shit, like this isn't gonna work, like something's off, whatever. And then have the next idea of like, what if I change it this way? And then go back out and pitch it again and like run that little loop. And if you have to like go back, type up your notes, send your notes to like, I don't know, the other person who's doing the sales pitch, have them go out and do the pitch, they type their notes. I mean, you see how inefficient that is of like finding what is a good idea? So that's why we look for it in that one person. Sometimes it's two because they do the call together. But yeah, they've evolved quite a bit. Each one has evolved. Flatiron a lot more because we didn't know anything when we started. This one is a little bit less because we had a little bit of a head start on the idea. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting response because it makes it sound like the main feedback loop is with investors, but I'm sure it was more than that.
We did everything. Investor, customer, expert.
Okay.
In our world, it was investors just because that's what the business was. But yeah, I don't just mean investor. I kind of mean like anybody knowledgeable about the industry. The hard part about all of it is like sometimes you get a really smart person who tells you something that's wrong. And it happens more than you think, right? Because, you know, maybe they're really good at this, but they're not good at that. And they don't realize it. And then they'll say it with really high confidence. And so there's four co-founders of Curie. There's two of us who are like the business people, and then there's the real deal, the actual people who do the work. we just do the like business structuring. And he taught me, I love this question. I mean, I'm still learning shit. I'm like pretty good at this. I still find like, oh my God, I wish I knew this tactic. Ask somebody how they know. Like, okay, that's not going to work because X, Y, Z. That's really interesting. That's cool. How do you know that? And if they can point you to a paper, an article, a fact or something, now you go, oh, okay, that person actually knows what they're. Most of the time, you will find they are just repeating something they heard. And they don't actually know it. And it's just total bullshit. And doesn't mean the fact is wrong, by the way. It just means they don't know that the fact is right or wrong. They just like repeated it. You just have to do that in a very gentle way because people get very defensive. It's sometimes very uncomfortable. Like you're in some of these calls and you can tell that person is pissed that you asked them that question and they're like, you know, how could you ask me how I, you know, and usually what I've seen is the people who get defensive don't know what they're talking about, and the people who do are like, oh, yeah, I read it in this paper. Do you want me to like send you the, you know, it's like, it's so easy and clean because they actually know where they found it, that fact. You just have to use that tool kind of sparingly, I guess. Yeah, it can be decisive. I just learned that one like a year ago because I was always trying to like tease it out, like, oh, that's so interesting. How could I find out more, whatever. And he was just like, just ask them how they know it. I was like, oh, fuck, that's like a way easier tactic than I was using. Only took me 16 years to figure that out. So, yeah, some people are very good at this, you know. Learn from them.
It's a good tip.
How do you think about, first of all, I think this is great. I love how concrete you are, and it's super helpful. How did you think about selling Flatiron, and what went into your decision making, and then how did you think about the timing also?
Well, someone offered us $2 billion, so it was like pretty easy. I was like, well, I own like a decent, yeah, that's pretty good. That's the actual answer. Why, you know, we did, the actual story is we did this model, financial model, of like what the company looks like in 5 years and what the growth rates would look like and what the margin structure would look like. We basically had our CFO like, what could this be if it were public? And we didn't like what we saw. And the variety, without going all into details, but basically you saw this like weird revenue S curve where like it was gonna grow and then it was gonna like grow slower. And it had to do with the dynamics of the market and basically that there's like not enough pharma companies to sell this to. You kind of like run out of customers, very weird. And we looked at that and we're like, all right, anyone have any genius ideas of like how to make the curve not do that? And debated it for a while. And I had a bunch of ideas that I had no confidence in. Like I'm like, oh, maybe this thing could work, this thing could work. But they weren't products we had built yet. They weren't products that we had tested yet. And so I just was like, we have to sell this because we're not gonna like it when growth slows. And then we ran a process, a clever process to sell it, and you know, it didn't start at 2, it was a lot lower. We found the right moment in that curve to go out, I think, because it was still growing and there was still a lot of hype, and we're like, well, let's go take advantage of this. And we got very lucky in the timing. So, you know, if we had sold it today, there's no way it's $2 billion. It's probably a quarter of that, would be my guess. And now we're seeing people who were like overly optimistic about their own thing pay the price, right? Because like the world is reset. It's the hardest thing I think about being a founder, not the hardest, a hard thing is like you spend all your time talking about how awesome everything is because you have to like recruit and sell and all that. But then in the back of your head, you have to like have a reasonably objective view of like, how good is this? Especially if you get offers to sell it along the way. So that's why we sold it. It was a good decision. You know, knowing what we know now, we made the right decision for sure. Yeah. The first one now, I look back and I'm like, yeah, like we nailed it and we didn't realize it. We were like at the beginning, I thought the like programmatic ad tech stuff was gonna grow and then it just like took off and we underestimated the curve. Part of it was I was like 22, I didn't know how to do anything. So, you know, someone offers you $80 million, which is what the offer was at the time. You're like, I'm going to take this. But we had a competitor who started after us that's like worth $25 billion. The Trade Desk, right known as Trade Desk. And now I look back on it and I'm like, that we were in the lead. That would have been, we had a shot. I don't think we would have been able to pull it off. I don't think we knew how to run a company like that. And the guy who started the trade desk is a very seasoned operator. He's a good, really good entrepreneur. That one I definitely think about.
Does your experience selling into pharma, like tech and services, did that inform the decision to focus Curie on the therapeutics as opposed to infrastructure for discovery? Because I feel like someone with your background, it would be a natural. Because there's a rise of like TechBio.
Yeah, I didn't want to do enterprise sales again. Totally. Like, I did it. It sucked. It's hard. It's a lot of like get on a plane and put on a suit and pitch to a room and hope they like it and then pitch to the room again and like do it for like 7 years. And it's tiring. And yeah, I wouldn't have started another company if I thought I was going to have to do enterprise sales again. I didn't not do it because I thought it was a bad idea. I just didn't want to do it. I was done with that stuff. Now, ironically, I end up pitching quite a bit, but it's just not to pharma. It's mostly to like investors. Yeah, definitely. It's tough. You know, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of like hotels and stuff like that. So I didn't want to do that again. But if I were starting from scratch and you know I had a good idea, I wouldn't say selling to bio and pharma is a bad thing. I would say selling just to pharma is a bad thing because you really limit. How many pharmaceutical companies are there? 20, 30 that matter. So if your market for your product is like companies with approved drugs, it's going to be tight. It's not that many. And they consolidate, right? So you get one customer gets bought by the other customer. They look at their contracts. You know, they're like, oh, I'm going to combine that contract. Versus selling to like the discovery group is much bigger, much broader, much wider customer base. So it's part of why we're there in discovery. Pharma's tough, really tough.
I have the impression that therapies are improving across all categories, are improving faster than care delivery is improving across categories. But I think that percent of spend in therapies is maybe stable or going down relative to delivery.
It's up. Like the percentage of Medicare spend is a good one to look at. That's like therapeutics broadly as a percentage of total spend is trending up.
Do you think that'll continue, or do you think other underlying factors will change that?
I mean, there's a few interesting things in this statement. Like one is, do I think the drugs are getting better faster than the care? Yes. I think primarily because you're rewarded heavily for better drugs than you are for better care, right? Like the better surgeon doesn't make $50 billion, you know what I mean? Like it just doesn't happen. And so there's just more people trying to innovate in therapeutics than there would be in care delivery. To the point where sometimes we hurt ourselves because of this, because like we only view innovation as like a thing regulated by the FDA. That's where all the reward comes from, right? Pill, biologic, whatever. But this is why some of the digital health stuff is a real challenge because there's no payment, right? Because just because it's an app or a behavioral modification or something, we're like, that's not a drug. And so like we don't pay for that in the same way, right? That doesn't have its own J code. And so all of a sudden you have these like actually pretty interesting digital therapeutics, to use the term loosely, that actually work, but like getting them paid for is such a disaster because it's not a drug. And that's a weird history of like rules and regs that should be changed. Like my opinion is if you run a clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial that shows that your thing is better than the standard of care on a outcome measure that matters, survival, whatever, you know, like your A1C level, like depending on the disease, you should get paid for it. Because why do we care if it's an app or a device or a drug? We shouldn't care, it just works. But that's not how it works, which is odd. So you see a lot of innovation in therapeutics because you get paid. And everything else was a little slower. And do I think it's going to continue? Yes, for a while. For a bunch of, I mean, we're just getting better at making them, right? So like you just have more stuff, like it's going to cost more. You know, this idea that like we keep people healthy longer and that's cheaper, no. How does that make any sense? Like they're alive for longer. There's more people you're paying for. Like, it just mathematically doesn't make any sense. And then you have this other issue, which is that you have this like population boom in Medicare coming, but we don't have the replacement tax base for it because people stopped having as many kids. And so basically you're keeping the older people who are the most expensive and the sickest alive longer to use more healthcare, but it's paid for by basically like this crew. So that's going to be an issue. And that's not like a Democrat Republican thing. I just view that as like, that's just the math. So somehow we're going to have to figure out how we handle this because the demographics, if you will, don't look great. I think we might see an Alzheimer's or dementia drug that really works. And if that happens, like that alone will pop the budget. I mean, you think of the number of people who are going to suffer from, it's like tens of millions of people, right? So like that just one of those drugs could pop. We have this, people may have read, there's these new weight loss drugs that are coming out from Eli Lilly has one, and there's another one coming, and they're good. Like the history of weight loss drugs, none of them work, and they have really bad side effects. And so they don't really do much. And like this new one, I can't remember the name, I don't remember offhand. Yes, semaglutide. Yeah, like they work, which is I think shocking to most people. And so there will be a second gen of that and a third gen of that are even better and even better because that's how drug discovery works, right? You like tweak and tweak and tweak. That category is tens of billions, right? Weight loss, it affects everything. So yeah, I see this just doing that for a while, and at some point something's going to break, you know. The thing is, like, if they continue to regulate price, because some of the drug prices are crazy, obviously, like you pay a lot for stuff that doesn't work, but you also pay a lot for stuff that does work. And if we don't distinguish between those two, and we don't really, then eventually the incentive to build the stuff that does work goes away. And so it's just like the US political system doesn't allow for like reasonable debate and conversation about, okay, maybe we should try and think about like the efficacy of these drugs before we, like, my thesis has always been the right approach is I will pay you more, way more for the good ones. Like, you want $1 million a year for something that works, like that cures, go for it. Like, we'll pay you $2 million a year, but we're not paying for the shitty one. The problem is, like, we don't agree on what works. There isn't, like, what does works mean and how much is works worth? And then you get into all these conversations that are more like philosophical in nature and ethical in nature. And it's really hard. It's really hard to get anybody to agree on this stuff. And then, you know, farmers got a good lobby, so that hurts. I feel like that was a very negative take on this, but that's kind of what I think. Yeah.
You were describing, sorry to keep asking about like Flatiron because you're clearly pretty fired up about everything as well, but when you were describing Flatiron, like part of what I heard you describe is that you kind of took like one complicated thing and another complicated thing and you pulled it off. And even when you were describing like what makes a good healthcare founder, it was about understanding the details, and it's less on the software, more on like the orchestration of a complicated business model.
Yeah, system.
How do you know, or any tips on when like a complicated business model is potentially like too complicated?
I think in general, you know stuff is working or can work when smart people are telling you it can work. Like, it should be more obvious because you're pitching people and then they're like, yeah, that actually could make sense. You know, and you find a bunch of the skeptics who normally would say this is like not going to happen, and they're actually interested. You find the experts. That's what started to happen with Flatiron. Eventually, we started pitching a bunch of healthcare people, and they were like, "Actually, yeah, that could work. That could, you know, I don't know how you're going to do this, 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 and this." And I'm like, "All right, I think I have an idea for those, but you know, to the business work, right? Could we take the data from here and clean it up this way and sell it over here? Like, does that work?" And we started to get a consistent. The math makes sense, and then we were doing a little napkin math, but we were hearing it. I think that was the key. You heard it from smart people who knew what they were talking about. Like, not your friends, right? You want to hear it from like the expert, you know, in that area. Same thing happened here with Curie. I would pitch it to a bunch of these like old school VCs. I had been in biotech for a while. And in the beginning, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, sure, you have this new model for biotech." Like, "All right, little tech boy." And then eventually you could see them go like, "Okay, yeah, actually this could no, that makes sense. That structure could work. You actually like see people physically lean in. They would do this, you know. And that was when I knew it had real legs. But it took a while to get there. Year and a half. Yeah.
Who's got a burning question?
You keep mentioning how important customer conversations and just conversations in general have been for your success. Like, do you have any advice for people to get their foot in the door into conversations before you were an employee?
Yeah, like how did we do? I mean, look, like you have to practice. You have to practice the story. You have to practice the flow. I would actually suggest for most people you should write it down. Like when I go out and now I don't have to use a deck because I've done it so many times, but like in the beginning, I had a deck, I had a story, I had an outline. I still have my notes. Like when I get on a call today, I got like the Zoom thing on here and I have my notes over here in case I forget something. I want to make sure I hit these points. And like I've literally done this pitch probably 500 times. Same story, but I still keep the notes up. So it's a skill. I think you have to practice anything to be good at it. And so you just practice it. Learn your fact. What's the thing you're going to share that's interesting to them? I think people use or underuse expert networks. There are groups out. I mean, you have to pay for it, but like GuidePoint, GLG, you can be like, find me an expert in this thing who's done this and is like willing to talk to me in the next 5 days. Go, and they will do that pretty well, actually. Now, it's going to cost you $1,000 an hour, so like you better use the time wisely and be good at it, but you can get to a lot of people that way, and then sometimes they'll recommend someone else. And we actually, even at Curie, we use it. We see some idea, we're like, I don't know if we know this whatever area. GuidePoint, find the person, do the call, take the notes. Yeah, as with anything, like it's a skill. You have to practice it. You have to like tweak and tweak and tweak. I mean, even with the Curie story, it took us a while. Like, we didn't have a hook. It took us a while. Like, what's that pithy hook? And then my co-founder was like, you can't start a therapeutics company in your garage. I was like, yes, that's it. Because I can stick that on a slide and someone will go, oh, that's an interesting it kind of like, it pulls you in a little bit. That was 2 months to come up with that. I don't remember exactly how we did it before, but it wasn't working as well. And we put that on the slide, it started to work. Yeah. There's a lot more failure along the way, I think, than people realize. It's like you're trying to fail forward. I'll just like do it this way. By the time we were done, I didn't use the deck, right? Because then I could tell the story. But for the first 100 calls or so, it was like surreal. With PowerPoint. I mean, it's PowerPoint. Yeah.
So I guess that's it on time? Oh, no, I mean, that was amazing. Thank you, Zach.
Happy to.
Thanks for all the great questions.